Chapter 1. The Assignment. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had studied enough abandoned places to know that every ruin held secrets, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of silence that pressed down on her as she stood before the crumbling gates of Dokha Monastery. The ancient Tibetan structure perched on the edge of Kathmandu like a forgotten prayer, its weathered stones blackened by decades of monsoon rains and neglect. "You sure about this, Doctor?" Pemba, her local guide, shifted nervously behind her, his weathered hands gripping the straps of his worn backpack. "The locals. They don't come here anymore. Not since the incident." Sarah adjusted her camera equipment and pushed a strand of auburn hair from her face. The September heat was stifling, but something about this place made her skin prickle with an inexplicable chill. "What incident?" she asked, though she'd already read the reports. In 1987, all 12 monks residing in the monastery had vanished overnight. No bodies were ever found, no signs of struggle, just gone. Pemba's eyes darted toward the monastery's dark windows. "The monks, they say they heard whispers in the walls, voices of the dead, calling them home." Sarah had heard similar stories from superstitious locals before. As an architectural anthropologist, she documented dozens of abandoned religious sites across Asia. Ghost stories were part of the territory. "Superstition," she said firmly, stepping through the rusted gate. "I'm here to document the deterioration of 15th century Tibetan monastery architecture, nothing more." But as they walked up the stone path, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Chapter 2. First Night. The monastery's interior was a maze of shadowed corridors and crumbling prayer halls. Shafts of golden evening light filtered through broken windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like restless spirits in the air. Sarah methodically photographed the intricate wood carvings, the faded murals depicting Buddhist deities, the ornate butter lamp holders now empty and cold. "I'll set up camp in the main prayer hall," she told Pemba, as the sun began to sink behind the hills. "It's the most structurally sound area." Pemba shook his head vigorously. "No, Doctor, we should camp outside, please." But Sarah was already unpacking her sleeping bag near the massive stone Buddha that dominated the hall. The statue's serene face seemed to watch her every movement, its painted eyes glinting in the fading light. "I need to experience the space authentically," she insisted. "Besides, you're welcome to camp outside if you prefer." Pemba reluctantly agreed to stay, though he positioned his bedroll as close to the exit as possible. As night fell, the monastery transformed. What had seemed merely abandoned in daylight now felt actively malevolent. The wooden beams creaked overhead with sounds that resembled footsteps. Shadows shifted in ways that didn't match the movement of Sarah's flashlight beam. But it was the whispers that started around midnight that made her blood run cold. At first, she thought it was the wind through the broken windows. But as she lay perfectly still, she realized the sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate. They seemed to come from within the walls themselves, soft, urgent voices speaking in a language she couldn't identify. Sarah sat up, her anthropologist's curiosity overriding her fear. She pulled out her digital recorder. "Day 1, 12:17 a.m., she whispered into the device. "Experiencing unexplained auditory phenomena. Could be wind patterns created by the monastery's unique architecture, or..." The whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the voices had been. Chapter 3. The Discovery. Sarah woke to find Pemba's bedroll empty. Her guide was nowhere to be found. She searched the monastery grounds, calling his name, but received only the echo of her own voice in response. His backpack remained where he'd left it, his belongings undisturbed. Fighting down panic, Sarah forced herself to continue her work. Documentation was her anchor to rationality, her protection against the monastery's increasingly oppressive atmosphere. In a small chamber behind the altar, she made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath centuries of dust and debris was a wooden trap door. When she pried it open, a musty odor wafted up from the darkness below. Her flashlight beam revealed stone steps descending into what appeared to be an underground tunnel. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to abandon the monastery and never look back. But something else, a compulsion she couldn't name, drew her down into the darkness. The tunnel was older than the monastery above, its walls carved from living rock and adorned with symbols that predated Buddhism in the region. As Sarah followed the passage deeper underground, she began to understand why the monks had heard whispers in the walls. The tunnel was honeycombed with smaller chambers, each one containing collections. Personal belongings, glasses, jewelry, clothing from different eras. Documents, passports, identification cards, letters written in various languages. Photographs, hundreds of them, showing people who had clearly vanished over the decades. Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed the evidence. This wasn't a haunted monastery. It was something much worse. A methodical, organized operation that had been claiming victims for generations. She turned to flee and found herself face to face with someone she hadn't expected to see again. Something resembling pride. Since I was 16, my father taught me, as his father taught him. This place has been feeding our family for generations. Chapter 5. The Final Twist. Sarah ran. She knew the tunnel system better than Pemba expected. Her methodical exploration had mapped most of the passages. She ducked through a narrow opening that led to a parallel corridor, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as she fled. Behind her, Pemba's voice echoed. "Dr. Mitchell, there's no way out down here. The only exit is through me." But Sarah had noticed something in one of the chambers, fresh air currents that suggested another opening. She followed the subtle breeze through increasingly narrow passages until she found it, a natural cave entrance hidden by overgrown vegetation. She emerged into pre-dawn darkness on the far side of the hill, gasping and shaking. The monastery loomed above her, its windows now seeming to watch with malevolent intent. Sarah stumbled down the hillside toward Kathmandu, her mind already composing the report that would expose the truth. The police would need to search those tunnels, identify the victims, bring justice to Dr. Mitchell. She spun around. Pemba stood 10 feet away, no longer the humble guide, but something far more predatory. In the grey dawn light, she could see details she'd missed before. The calculated coldness in his eyes, the way his hands were stained with something darker than dirt. "You can't let me reach the police," she realized. "I'm afraid not. But I want you to know I genuinely enjoyed our time together. You're more observant than most. It's almost a shame." He lunged forward with the knife, but Sarah was ready. She'd grabbed a loose stone during their conversation, and she struck with all the force of her terror behind it. Pemba crumpled, blood streaming from his temple. Sarah didn't wait to check if he was dead. She ran until she reached the first police checkpoint, where her gasping, incoherent story eventually led to one of the largest criminal investigations in Kathmandu's history. Epilogue. 6 months later. The Doka Monastery murders made international headlines. Police excavated 127 bodies from the tunnel system, some dating back over 4 decades. Pemba survived his head injury and was sentenced to life imprisonment, though he died in his cell 3 weeks later, officially from a heart attack, though the guards spoke quietly of whispers that seemed to come from the walls of his cell. Sarah returned to her university position, but she never took another assignment involving abandoned religious sites. The rational part of her mind insisted that everything had a logical explanation, that Pemba's family had simply exploited local superstitions to create the perfect hunting ground. But sometimes, late at night in her office, she could swear she heard whispers in the walls. And sometimes, those whispers sounded like voices calling her name. In the ruins of Doka Monastery, local authorities have placed warning signs in multiple languages. The site remains sealed, though hikers occasionally report seeing lights in the windows and hearing voices carried on the mountain wind. The whispers, it seems, never truly stopped.